probably the most important thing for communicators is that you recognize that you have the choice about how to label your feelings and then what to do about them. And that begins with understanding that there are, in fact, 4 different words that we use related to this concept of feelings. And those 4 words are affect, with an A, affect, emotions, feelings, which I call thought feelings, and moods. I call it FEMA, F-E-M-A, for the Federal Emergency Management Agency, because these are like your FEMA of emotions. And there's a chart in your study guide about the difference between an intensity, a feeling, and a mood, and the way that they look kind of on a graph that I think is helpful for describing the relationship between intensity and time. So first of all, affect, which is something that we don't often talk about. Affect is just a kind of general stimulation or response in your body that requires interpretation and labeling in order to make sense of it. So when you're talking about affect, you're talking about maybe a little bit of a headache, or you're talking about sort of a buzzing or vibration sensation. You're talking about warmth in your chest or tightness in your shoulders. You're talking about sort of like the clenching of your face, tingling in your legs, sort of this general feeling of arousal and stimulation. But as soon as you add an interpretation to that, I feel restless, I feel energetic, I feel nervous, then you've taken the affective state, which is just a series of physiological stimuli, and you've labeled it something, right? You've decided what that is. And for most of us, we just kind of assume that certain affective states mean certain things. So I'm feeling this way, it must be angry. But we're typically pretty wrong about that. So for most of us, the way we label our affective states is a matter of how we've been socialized. We actually have never thought about the fact that affect states, so these kinds of like stimulation or arousal that we get in our bodies, they don't really have any meaning by themselves. We kind of get to choose what the meaning is that we've associated. So as opposed to emotions, which are affects that have been kind of hardened into definite things, sadness, anger, jealousy, affect is a general state of arousal. And what you call that affect, how you choose to label it, is up to you. And the best I can say is that certainly you can't label every single emotion. Certainly you can't label every single affective state however you want, because you're not going to take every affective state and just say, oh, this must be happiness. It doesn't quite work that easily. But the idea that you have an affective state and then suddenly you're angry, or you have an affective state and oh, that must mean you're sad, or you have an affective state and that must mean you're nervous, it's much more complicated than that, and you have a lot more free will in that decision than you think you do. So the emotions nervous and excited are really good examples, because what happens is you feel like a tightness in your stomach, maybe like kind of a rumbling, sort of like a fluttering in your stomach. We call that butterflies. It can feel tight. It can feel sort of just like churning. And maybe your head is a little bit buzzy. You sort of feel a little bit like of a heightened intensity around your body. You might feel more alert than usual. Your pulse might be a little faster, your skin might feel warm, your face might feel flushed, or your hands can feel clammy. Those are all affective states. Now here's the question. Is that describing you being nervous about giving a speech in front of a large crowd? Or is that you being excited about giving that speech? Are you excited about going on a first date, or are you nervous, right? So the same physiological symptoms could be nervous or excited about the same exact thing, depending on how you've been taught to interpret those affective states. So if you grew up around people who were constantly talking about how scary public speaking is, you're much more likely to interpret all those physiological symptoms as fear. But who knows, if you'd grown up in a network of like professional YouTubers, you might feel much more excited about that. So again, recognizing that your affective states, right, the tingling in your throat, the warmth that you might feel, a little bit of clamminess, the sweat, the sort of vibration in your body, that's really just a bunch of chemicals flooding your body in response to different stimuli. But calling that an emotion is much more complex than just it just automatically being an emotion. Emotions are not hardwired. They are communication choices to label affective states. I'm going to say that again. Emotions are not hardwired. They are communication choices to label affective states. Okay, so now that we know what an affective state is, let's talk about your options for labeling those affective states, right? So first of all, there's emotion. So an emotion is an intense reaction to an event that involves interpreting the event's meaning, becoming physiologically aroused, right? There's your affective piece, labeling the experience with an emotional term, managing your reactions to it, and also communicating either through emotional displays or verbal disclosure. You really have to have all 5 of those components for it to be a full emotion, and lots of things you experience in your life are not emotions. while it's not just like you can pick any emotion out of thin air and just suddenly feel it, it's certainly not that simple. It's not as complicated as, well, I just get so angry and that's just the end of it. No, you feel certain physiological symptoms. You've associated those physiological symptoms with anger. You are doing the kinds of things to ramp up your association of that as anger, and then you're acting as if it was an inevitable choice, but it's not. So you kind of have to be able to distinguish between whether that affective state deserves the label of emotion or whether it deserves another label. So affect to emotion is the most typical kind of labeling we have, but there are two other kinds of ways that you can process affect. One is this thing we call feelings. Now, typically people use feelings and emotions in the same way. I think it's helpful to think of them as different things because we often talk about emotions and feelings and this other thing called moods as if they're all the same thing, but they're not. Feelings, which I actually call thought feelings. I never just say feelings. I have emotions, thought feelings, and moods, okay? They're short-term emotional reactions. They're really like pseudo-emotional to events that generate very limited arousal. So thought feelings typically do not come with the same kinds of acute physical symptoms that an emotion would. And they don't typically trigger attempts to manage their expression or experience because they're not that strong. We experience probably like, I think somebody said at some point, like 50,000 thoughts a day. So we probably experience somewhere around that number of feelings. And most of them last a few seconds, half a second, maybe a minute or two, but you have tons of them, right? Which is good because you have lots of chances then to work with your thought feelings. And of course, if you're feeling so many emotions during the day, you might want to start to think about like toning some of those emotions down so they're more like thought feelings. Likewise, if you never experience any emotions and you're always just experiencing thought feelings, you might want to think about adding more emotions into your vocabulary because it could be that you're not comfortable feeling certain emotions that would be helpful for you to feel. There's really no way, on my view, to distinguish between thoughts and feelings. That's why I combine them, because I just don't see how you can separate a thought from a feeling. If you think something like, that sandwich looks really good, you feel something, right? You might feel excitement, you might feel anticipation, you might just feel like passing interest, but you do have a feeling, right? You have some kind of association to that thought. It's impossible for people to have thoughts that do not have some kind of what we call valence, V-A-L-E-N-C-E. That valence isn't necessarily a full-blown emotion, but it's impossible for us to have a thought and not evaluate whether the thought is good or bad. So for example, for me, if I have a passing thought, that sandwich looks good, of course I'm going to then ask, like, am I hungry? Do I want a sandwich? Can I eat a sandwich? Would I be happy? I mean, your brain is just going to go through all that stuff really fast. For most of us, we just jump from, I saw the sneakers in the middle of the carpet that my partner left, to I got really frustrated because I always have to keep the house clean. But there was a thought in the middle of there, right? And the thought was probably something like, man, that asshole should probably pick up their shoes. But like, they're tired and they just got home and it's a pair of fucking shoes. Like, what do you care? So you have to have had a thought to have a thought feeling. You can't just have a feeling out of nowhere. Also, if you think all your feelings are emotions, right, these big blown up displays of like strong affect and the need to disclose, then you're like hyping everything up and everything is a giant issue and then all of your reactions are much more intense. Whereas sometimes you just look at the cigarette or you look at the sneakers and you go, huh, I have a thought about that. I have a little bit of a feeling, but I'm not going to go into like full-blown emotion territory. So again, these are all choices that you have. That's why we teach you this vocabulary, because you, to a certain extent, get to label your affective states as feelings, moods, or emotions based on what you want out of it. And affect is just a nice vocabulary term to have in your arsenal because it gives you a way of describing the physical arousal that happens to you in response to stimuli without turning it into a feeling, a mood, or a thought without having time to evaluate that. All right, the last one is moods. So moods, in terms of arousal, so in terms of your affective state, moods are very low intensity. Boredom, contentment, restlessness, flow. So right now, for example, I am in flow because I'm reading off my thing. I feel like aroused because my heart rate's going up because I'm on camera, so this requires some emotional intensity. But it's not an emotion because I don't really feel strong. Like, I didn't even really feel the need to disclose that to you. It's not taking up space in my psychic energy. It's just I have this kind of general affective state that's kind of low intensity, which is good because it has to last hopefully a couple hours while I do all my work today. So I don't want to ramp up the intensity because when things are super intense, it's hard to feel them for a long time. So moods are helpful because they're low intensity states and they last a much longer time. So they don't typically have a conscious event attached to them. Moods tend to be more general labels of affective states that have longer duration. And they definitely last much longer than feelings or emotions. They can be positive or negative. So like if you think of your frequent, like sort of fleeting feelings and thoughts, just like feelings, thoughts, it's like ripples in water. And then the emotions are like these intense waves that kind of come once in a while. Your mood is just kind of like still water, just kind of like vibrating around. Moods are still caused by thoughts, everything is, but they stick around much longer and in much lower forms, so we often don't even know the thoughts that are causing our mood. And if you've ever been in a situation where for days or even weeks sometimes you're just grumpy or you just don't feel like it, it's rare, but sometimes we wake up and we're just like in a good mood or we're content or we're grateful and today's just like going well, but we don't really know why. There is always a reason for it. There's always thoughts that are going on in the back of your mind, but we're just not often super aware. And part of that is because we use the phrase, oh, I'm just in a mood, to like explain it to ourselves. I'll give you an example. Procrastination is a mood, right? It's the act of I just don't wanna. And so for a lot of us, we're like, oh, well, I just don't wanna, as if that is an answer to a question. It's not, right? Well, why don't you wanna? Like, what are the thoughts that are keeping you from doing the thing that you know that you're supposed to be doing? We're using the mood of procrastination as an excuse not to examine the thoughts that bring up procrastination. So this is why moods can be dangerous, because whereas emotions are more likely to prompt you to know what is causing the emotion, moods can be more resistant to that practice. But of course, as you get better at this, you'll be even more able to identify why you have certain moods. Because some moods you want to keep around, right? You want to keep around the mood of contentment. You want to keep around the mood of graciousness. You want to keep around the mood of grateful. You want to keep around the mood of flow. You want to keep around the mood of relaxed. But you may not want to keep around the mood of like procrastination or entitlement or don't feel like it or cranky. And so you have to use the thoughts that you're thinking as levers to make a change if that's what you want to do. First of all, emotion is reactive. It's triggered by our perception of outside events. When an emotion-inducing event occurs, we engage in the same perceptual process as we do with other types of interpersonal events, right? We select, we organize, and we interpret information. And as we interpret the information, we decide whether it's positive or neutral, and then we start to decide, like, what is it? Is it fear? Is it anger? Is it disappointment? Is it excitement? But again, it's not an automatic thing to just know, oh, I'm excited, right? I have to go through a bunch of options, and usually it's my history or habit that determines how I label my arousal, not something like in nature. The second feature of emotion is that it does require a strong affective response. So it involves physiological arousal in the form of increased heart rate, blood pressure, adrenaline release, cortisol spikes, dopamine floods, neurotransmitters increase, neurotransmitters decrease. That's all part of the affective state. But the emotion is not the same as the affective state. The emotion is the label you add on to the affective state to make sense of what's happening. Third, to experience emotion, you need to become aware of your interpretation and arousal as an emotion. That is, you must consciously label your sense of physiological arousal as an emotion. It's the labeling that distinguishes the emotion from the affect. Because, for example, people who have really practiced and worked at this hard, I'll give you an example. If every day you come home from class and you're exhausted and you're tired and you open the fridge and you want to have a beer or you want to turn on the TV, if you decide today you're not going to do those things, you're not going to have a cigarette, you're not going to grab a drink, you're not going to turn on the TV because you're trying to break that habit or whatever, you're going to feel all kinds of stuff in your body because you are breaking a pattern of behavior that your brain has gotten used to. You're going to feel all kinds of vibration in your body. You're going to feel buzzing and you're going to feel tingling and you're going to feel warmth in your leg and you're going to feel stress, right? How you label that, though, is entirely optional. And you could choose not to label it at all. You could just choose to be like, okay, I am having a physical response to the fact that I've made a decision to not have a cigarette right now. But I don't have to label that as awkwardness, fear, restlessness, nervousness, stress, overwhelm, right? Those are choices that I make, and typically they're based on how I've been socialized. And for most of us, we have not been socialized with good emotional management. So to experience an emotion, you must become aware of the interpretation and arousal as an emotion, but even that part is kind of optional. You can't help that your body is going to send up certain dopamine, neurotransmitter, serotonin type responses, increase your rate. You can't help that that stuff is going to happen, but you can choose how to label it. And of course, labeling it also affects how you choose, because as soon as you label an emotion as stressful or overwhelming or frustrating or upsetting, you're enhancing those physiological states, as opposed to someone who says, oh, I'm just feeling some kind of way about this, and they don't then add the drama to the behavior. And if you've ever worked out really hard, like if you've run really fast or you've weightlifted and you're used to it, and you get done from a really intense workout and your body feels very flushed and your legs feel kind of fatigued from the lactic acid, and maybe you feel kind of that flood of adrenaline, most people who exercise routinely don't label that. It's just what happens when you exercise. And it's very similar to a lot of the other physiological arousal that we have. We don't have to label those things as stressful. We just do. But you don't have to label them, because, frankly, just because your body has a certain affective response, gets warm, gets flushed. I mean, for example, if you're outside and the sun is beating down on you and you're really hot, you don't have an emotion about that. You just label, oh, the sun is hot and my skin is reacting, right? You might feel some kind of way about it. You might be happy or you might be angry because you don't like the sun or whatever, or you're sunburned so you're frustrated. But the physical act of getting warm from the sun, you don't label emotionally. And yet the same kind of sense when you get up in front of a crowd, or you hear somebody say something about you that maybe is negative, that same flushed sense, that warm skin, you'll instantly label that as if it has emotional content. But really, physiologically, there's no difference between those two things. It's just your choice to label it emotional. All right, fourth. Our emotional experiences, we've talked about this, and expressions are constrained by historical, cultural, relational, and situational norms regarding appropriate behavior and how certain cues behave with certain emotions. As a consequence, once we become aware that we're experiencing the kind of arousal that we associate with an emotion, we try, whether we know it or not, to manage that experience and express that emotion in ways that we think would be acceptable. So that means an emotion isn't given. So if you think I'm angry, it's a choice conditioned by your habits of circumstance. So the same two people can feel very, very similarly, right? They can have the same flushed skin, same beating pulse, same kind of buzzing in their ears. But if you grew up in a culture or a family of origin where expressing anger was not acceptable, you're not going to interpret that stuff as anger. And you're also probably not going to feel it to the same degree as someone else. Whereas if you grew up in a family where yelling was the norm and people just fly off the handle whenever they want, you're going to be a lot quicker to turn those same signals into this emotion called anger. But it's not a biological predeterminant, right? You've been socialized to interpret cues into certain emotions. All right. And last, right, the last characteristic of emotional is that you communicate emotion. And you have to, and that doesn't necessarily mean talking, but for emotion to be an emotion, you have to kind of do something with it. So you can verbal or non-verbally sort of display the emotion. You can make certain word choices. You can swear. You can make facial expressions. You can have certain body posture, right? So you might feel pride and you might go, right? And not even know that you did it. You might grimace. You might like sigh outwardly. And sometimes, of course, you know you're doing that stuff. So for example, if I feel irritated, but I don't want to say I feel irritated, I might go like, and just hope that somebody else notices. But as soon as you've done that, you've entered into this realm of emotion. And so sometimes, for example, if you get home and your partner has kicked their shoes off, like, so let's suppose you're sitting here and your partner gets home from work and they walk across the floor and they kick their shoes off in the middle of the floor and they just keep walking into the shower. And you're annoyed by that. You don't have to go like, get yourself extra worked up about the fact that that happened. That's a choice you make because you've decided very quickly, very subconsciously, that this is an emotional moment. But you could just look at the shoes and be like, damn, better ask him to move those shoes. And then go about your day, right? And then you don't have to verbally or non-verbally disclose the emotional communication because you've decided it's not an emotion. So the bottom line is that emotions are a choice. So you get to choose whether or not to label something an emotion, and